So the running joke is that I'm so into A/B testing that we got twins, but honestly, that had nothing to do with it. Good afternoon. So in the next 30 minutes, I want to talk about this thing. The title of this talk was taken from an academic paper that we wrote about half a year ago with several colleagues. And so the language is quite academic, so let me translate that for you. Online controlled experiments is just the academic term that we use for A/B testing. So this is just about scaling A/B testing at Booking.com. Now, I don't really want to go through the TLDR of this paper with you. I highly recommend you read it. You can find it online. Instead, what I would like to do is I would like to focus very much on one single thing that I think is the most important thing that is in this paper. And funnily enough, that most important thing is in the last paragraph, the last sentence of the first paragraph of the abstract. It's one of the first things we say, which is that our methods and our infrastructure were designed from their inception to reflect the Booking.com culture. That is, they were designed with democratization and decentralization of decision-making in mind. Now, these techniques, I recommend you read the paper, but they do assume that you have this in place already. So that is what I would like to talk about. And so I created this slide thinking I want to talk about the culture that makes this work at Booking.com. And then I realized that I don't actually know how to show you culture. That this is it's an interesting slide. This is our office in Amsterdam. But how do I explain to you what our culture is and what makes it work? And it took me a while to realize that the way that we perceive culture, the way that we see it, the way that I can show it to you is through the people that we interact with every day. And so I figured that if I could find some colleagues and have them say something about A/B testing, then this would be a good way to explain to you how Booking.com uses A/B testing. And so whenever anyone gives you a piece of data, then the most important question that you should ask first is, how did this data come about? Where does it come from? What was the method by which it was collected? And in academic papers, we call this the method section. It's a almost mandatory part of every paper where you explain how you went about the business of collecting the evidence and the data that's in the paper. So I'm giving you my method for this talk as an example. In most companies, if you want to collect some information about how people run experiments, you go to the experiment team, or you go to the CRO team. You go to the people that run the experiments. They're probably somewhere in the corner, hidden behind some desks, doing complicated things with statistics. Now, finding them and talking to them is probably the difficult part, and then you take their picture. But this is Booking.com. The most difficult part of this exercise for me was actually getting the pictures, because it's difficult to make pretty pictures. And so instead of starting from the people, I started from the riskiest or trickiest part of my plan. And so instead of approaching people, I approached our PR department, and I said, do you have any pictures of people that work for Booking? And they said, sure, yeah, we have pictures. Here's 20 of them. Then I filtered out all the people that don't run experiments, that management, DBAs, and that left me with about half of the pictures that I was sent. Then I selected 6 at random, and I sent them an email asking, how do you use experiments in your job? I didn't prime them otherwise. I didn't give them any other information about the talk. I just asked a very general question. Then magically, all of them responded. There is no missing data in my experiment. I had 6 replies. I copy-pasted them, put them on slides, and that's the talk. Data doesn't get much more raw than this. You are looking at raw culture. I cannot make it more salient for you. What you get is exactly what these people told me when I asked them this very generic question. I'll sprinkle in some context, because I think it's important that you also have some takeaways. But let's start with this human. My name's Lukas. I say I help hundreds of people run experiments to make Booking.com better. It's actually more like 1,500 people that run experiments at Booking.com. When people hear about Booking.com and they say, you run more than 1,000 tests, how is that possible? Well, you get more than 1,000 people to run experiments. That's simply the way that you scale. And so I don't personally run any tests. I operate at the meta level. I look at the people who run experiments and then think about better ways for them to run experiments. Now, Booking hardly needs any introduction. We were founded in 1996. We have 1.7 million properties, not 1.6. 1.5 million room nights per day, and this makes us one of the biggest e-commerce players on the planet. We're sort of the elephant in the e-commerce room. Everything is a test in the sense that we do not roll out a single change to our website without a controlled experiment. Earlier in the morning, Craig talked about this horrendous bug with zooming in on a particular page where this change made the entire website impossible to use, and by finding this and fixing it, they increased their conversion rate by a lot. And my only thought there was, how did this end up on that website in the first place? Did they roll out this change without considering what the impact of that change was? Now, that's something that Booking takes very seriously, and so even if we fix a bug where we know that this thing needs to be fixed, we still run a test. Because the worst thing that could happen is that we fix the bug and then create 3 other ones that cost us millions of euros. So when people tell me that they're looking for the ROI of experimentation, I'm a little bit flummoxed. Because how do I calculate the ROI of not putting that bug in production? I honestly don't know how I would. Right? If I test every single change on my website, and by that way, I make sure that no horrendous bugs like the one that Craig showed us end up on your website, what is the ROI of doing that? I don't know. It's potentially all of our revenue. Now, the mission that Booking has is to empower people to experience the world. And I put this on there not because I want to do corporate branding, but because this phrase, empowerment, was also something that came back from people when I asked them to talk about experimentation. It's not just a thing that we put in our mission statement, but it's something that within Booking also is very important to people. For instance, Clyde responded saying, data-driven is quite common these days in tech industry. However, empowering everyone to make data-driven decisions independently is quite unique to Booking. And I think this is what the democratization really speaks to, is that we try to use these tools to help other people make decisions instead of trying to keep them close to our chest and having all those decisions being made in the boardroom. Nikia, one of our copywriters, puts it in a little bit of a different context. She says, I can come up with an idea over breakfast, bike into the office, and have it live well before lunch. I've never worked anywhere else that gives me this level of ownership and creative freedom to validate my ideas. Now, there's a few things that are interesting here. The reason she can do this is because she doesn't have to ask for permission, right? It's fast to implement these things because she doesn't have to go to her boss to ask whether she can run an experiment. The other side is that I often hear people say that A/B testing kills creative freedom, but she's saying the opposite. By giving her these tools, we are giving her the room to be creative. And lastly, Heloise says this, I think it's great that the company encourage everyone to hack and test ideas among users, no higher value opinions, and no centralization of decision making. Now, the irony is that no centralization of decision making, this is made possible by centralizing the experimentation infrastructure itself. Because we all use the same tools to run experiments, we can all see each other's experiments. We can debate with peers what we think about, oh, did you see what that guy is running? Right. Because this is centralized, we actually decentralize the decision making. Now, the key, I think, here is that you cannot have a democracy without empowering the people. And like this is a little bit of a vapid statement maybe, but I hear lots of companies talking about being data-driven without considering that this also means that people will be making decisions and you might not agree with them. Leadership that says we want to be data-driven is saying, I want to not make those decisions anymore. And I think a lot of these data-driven projects, they fail because leadership says they want to be data-driven, but they're not willing to accept the consequences of that statement. Now, Hadir, when she sent me her reply, she initially apologized to me and said, you're not going to like this, but I think experimentation is a great way to figure out if something as small as a copy change or something as big as a whole book process will help users, but you cannot depend it as your only source of product validation. And I very much agree with this. I very much agree with this. I want to think back to Alexa's talk yesterday, where from my point of view, there was a lot of testing that went on before it even made it to production. There were a lot of theories that were being challenged, a lot of assumptions that were being challenged before they even got to the A/B testing part. And so this absolutely needs to happen. You cannot rely on A/B testing alone to drive that process. Has anyone seen this quote before? No one? Really? Wow. That's the first time that's happened. So I see this a lot at conferences that talk about data and data and marketing, and I think this quote is interesting for two reasons. The two reasons that it's wrong. The first reason that this is incorrect is that is not actually what Raymond Wolfinger said back in 1969. He actually said this. He said the plural of anecdote is data. Now, interestingly, if you Google for this, you will find more hits for this version than there are for this version. But this is the only one that actually makes sense. If I have an anecdote, this is data. If I have two anecdotes, this is more data. If I have a collection of cat pictures on my pen drive in my pocket, this is also data. But when people say this, what they really mean to say is that we are not interested in data. Data is not what we're after in an A/B test. What we want is evidence. Evidence for a thing. And so we don't want to be data-driven, we want to be evidence-based. And sometimes this evidence will take the form of data, but not always. Sometimes evidence can take the form of a rational argument. Now, I want to explain why all of this, I think, is important in the context of A/B testing by showing you this game that Carl did yesterday, where at some conferences, they'll ask you to stand up and raise your hand if you think A wins and raise your hand if you think B wins. And I think it's stupid, and I think it teaches us all the wrong lesson. Because what we learn, what we take home from this, is that we are terrible, terrible at guessing what will make the magic number go up. And what is often missing, and what I think Carl did very well, is that he explained why he thought one variant was going to win. And the interesting bit is that if you look at this, you say, look, let's change the button from yellow to blue and see if it increases the magic number. This is the optimization mindset. We're trying to optimize our conversion rate or our revenue or whatnot. And I show you A and B, and I ask you which of these is going to do better. You are guessing. You have no reason to believe one is better than the other. If I showed you a third version, C, that had a light green background, you would still be guessing. Now, let me change one thing about this slide that, for me, changes everything. Instead of website optimization, I want to do hypothesis testing. And the only thing I'm going to change is the description. Now, let me read it out to you. We observed in user research that some people have difficulty finding the Buy Now button. We suspect this is caused by a low contrast between the font and the background. To solve this user issue, we will change the button from yellow to blue. If the solution works, we expect to see more hovers, clicks, and eventually converts. Now, other than the description, nothing has changed here. The implementation is identical. The data that we will collect will be identical. But what has changed is in your heads, and what has changed is the evidential value and what you can learn from this particular test. And I think it's hugely important that we appreciate that the whole reason that we run A/B tests is because we want to do inference. We want to learn about our customers. And to do that, we need this part. We cannot skip it. The optimization mindset makes us lazy, and it makes us skip the most important part of an A/B test. Now, here's a few things that you can do now that I've explained this to you. Remember that third variant with the light green background? Which do you think is going to work? Better than dark blue? Why not? It doesn't increase the contrast. It's not even testing the theory that we were testing in the first place. I can do this without guessing. I can tell you that if you think that the contrast is going to help, then making a change that doesn't increase the contrast is not going to help. Second thing you can do, what if instead of making the background blue, I make the font black? That would increase the contrast. So maybe that works. Another thing you can do, if the test doesn't work, there's no change in user behavior after we made this change. What do we do next? Do we guess about the next thing? Well, I can see two avenues. One, contrast made people notice the button better, but they don't care about the button. This is the theory I can test by removing the button. Second theory, increasing the contrast didn't increase it enough. I will make the button blink. Now they'll fucking notice it. But I can do this because I have a description of what the test is trying to achieve. not because of anything that's in the data that we collect, not because of anything that's in the tooling that we have. It's all in my head. And we call this evidence-based customer-centric product development. And I think when Carl and when Craig talk about being customer-centric, about thinking what your changes do for your customer, then they're really talking about doing this in a customer-centric way, and I think the website optimization paradigm is counter to this idea. To do this, you need to have theories about your changes and why they change customer behavior. Finn put this very nicely when I asked him about why or how experimentation helps him in his job, and he says, well, we use experimentation to help us validate hypotheses with the goal of addressing well-defined user problems. And that means that you have to define those problems. You can't be lazy, right? You have to define what the problems are that you're trying to solve in the first place. Now, to help people do this within Booking, we've built tooling around our A/B testing platform that helps people write hypotheses and specify what the test is set out to achieve, to help find other tests that people have run trying to solve the same customer problems, etc. And one of the parts of that is this hypothesis template that you can use yourself, which has all of the important bits that need to be in a solid hypothesis if you want to test. It has a theory of why this would work, a validation mechanism for validating that it did work, and a core objective that you're trying to reach with the program as a whole. Now, you don't have to use the template as it is. You can mix it up and write your own hypotheses, but at least this way you make sure that you have all the important parts. Now, Diogo said an interesting thing. This is the last example I have, but he flips it on his head and he says, I'm not necessarily looking for improvements, but I'm trying to challenge the notions that I already have. I have assumptions about how people use my product. I have assumptions about what they're trying to do with my product. And so what I want to do is challenge them continuously, because that allows me to then work on the things that actually matter. And I think VWO shared this at some point. They said 9 out of 10 tests fail. And I think this is also the optimization paradigm, because failure is learning. And so if you do things correctly, then 10 out of 10 tests will be successful. True, not all of them will have positive ROI, but they will teach you which things matter to your customers and which things don't. If you try to fix a bug and you run a test and it drags your conversion rate down by 50%, then you don't implement the bug fix. Now, you have learned something, and I have no idea how to determine the ROI. The implementation failed, but I would still say this is a successful test because it stopped us from doing something really stupid that then we need to hire Craig for to figure it out 11 months later. Now, let me tell you, and finally, a personal story of failure to give you some sense of how all these things work together. When I joined Booking as a data scientist. This is 5 years ago. And the first thing I worked on was ranking and recommendation. My background is in machine learning. And so I worked on ranking. And this is approximately what our website looked like back in the day. And you can see there are multiple destinations that we show here on the right-hand side. For each destination, we also show 5 hotels. Now, I labored for 6 months working on algorithms to rank those 5 hotels, thinking of better ways to figure out which hotels to show. And my working theory was that we show great destinations and great hotels to people. People click on those hotels, then they find those hotels attractive, and then they book them. And because my eventual optimization goal is people booking them, the only thing I measured was whether people booked. Now, in those 6 months, we tried lots of different things. We layered different algorithms on top of each other. We did not try genetic algorithms, but we tried a bunch of other ones. And we tried to use context. What if we know the customer is coming from a Mac? What if we know where they're coming from Japan, etc.? And about 6 months in, we found a paper that had an interesting technique in it. And to use it, we would have to start collecting data about what hotels do people hover on and what hotels do people click. And so for the first time, we started to add telemetry to measure what people actually click on. Now, yesterday in Carl's presentation, he already gave you the answer to that question, because it's on the right-hand side of the page. No one clicks on the damn hotels. And so for 6 months, I had tried to optimize a thing that gets no traction whatsoever. And so then we set up what turned out to be the easiest but most impactful test that we had run in those 6 months. Can you think of what that test was? It's approximately this. This is one line of CSS applied to the page. It's display none. It still does all of the computation in the back end, so all of these rankings are still computed, but then it doesn't actually show them to customers. What do you think happened? Nothing. So for 6 months, I've been trying to optimize this thing that if you don't show it to people, nothing happens. Now, I was somewhat dismayed. I'm being political here. Flipped the table, told the devs to clean things up, and started working on other projects. Now, this is booking, so we don't really do anything to our website without running a test. And the developer said, well, if we're not going to show these hotels, we don't really have to compute them in the back end anyway. And so he started the cleanup work of not doing any of this complicated computation to compute which hotels to show. But then we don't roll that out without a test. So we started an A/B test, then instead of just hiding the hotels, stopped computing the hotels. What do you think happened? So if you stop computing rankings, your page gets faster. This is a landing page. People like fast landing pages. And so not only had I been working on something that doesn't actually add value for 6 months, I had been working on something that was adding negative value for 6 months. I didn't get fired, but I did learn from that. And what I learned is that you want to take the biggest small step so that you can challenge your riskiest assumption quickly. Let me try and unpack that. This change looks massive. It's a huge visual change, but it's the easiest thing that we had ever done in those 6 months. In terms of implementation cost, it was tiny. And so this is a big, small step. It's a step that I can take very easily that has a giant impact, hopefully. And when I say riskiest assumption, I mean those assumptions that if they are wrong, they would have very high cost to you in the future. In this case, the cost here is not necessarily the uplift that I'm losing as a result of the ROI, of the ranking, but it's the cost of having an entire team work for 6 months on a product that does nothing. What's the ROI on that? And so what I want people to do is challenge those risky assumptions very quickly. Make them explicit. What are you assuming when you run this test? And is there a quicker and easier way to challenge those underlying assumptions? Now, you might think of tests as testing only one idea at a time, but in reality, we're always layering assumptions on top of each other. So this simple test of changing the ranking of hotels is actually testing many different, or is built on many different assumptions at the same time. If we change the order of a few things, we are assuming that that order can be improved, that it's not already perfect. That assumes, in turn, that the order even matters, that if I show them in random order, then users will be less pleased by those results than if I did some magic. That, in turn, assumes that the feature is important, or that it can be improved, and that it matters to user, which in turn assumes that the page can be improved, and that is what is on the page even matters. Now, that last one sounds kind of weird, but if you think about this page, what do you think people do when they get to this page? Click in the yellow box, search, hit search. That's it. What does it matter what else is on the page if all they're going to do is go to the yellow box? So this assumption is something that needs to be tested, because it means that if people really do not care about anything but the yellow box, you can stop wasting your time trying to optimize the rest of the page. Now, this is what I mean when I say evidence-based, customer-centric product development, because we're trying to collect evidence against all of those assumptions that we're making. We're trying to prove them wrong so that we can figure out which things we should work on next. And we call that customer-centric because we are letting the customers decide what are the most important things for us to work on. We're trying to collect evidence on what they care about rather than what we care about. And so in the end, this is a story about people. I used 6 people from Booking.com to show you a little bit of how we work, but I think it's also a story about people in the sense that A/B testing is not about statistics. It's about listening to your customers.
You are using this as a tool not to optimize your website. You're using it as a tool to challenge the assumptions that you have about what your customers want from you. You think you understand your customers, you don't. There are many things that they want from you that you do not know yet. How will you learn what it is that matters to them? Because that is what allows you to empower them to use your product. And that is all that I had. Now, final comment. I very consciously excluded a term from this talk because whenever I use it, people's eyes glaze over. But I want to make it very clear. All of the stuff that I've been talking about here is called philosophy of science. There is nothing new about this. This whole field is more than 2,000 years old. A/B testing is not at the forefront of marketing, not even close. These techniques are ancient. We've just given them a new name. And if you want to learn more about A/B testing, I would encourage you to stop reading about A/B testing and start reading about the philosophy of science, about methodology, and about field experiments, because that's, in essence, what we are doing. Thank you.